everybody. I'm Evie Roberts, and this is my podcast, Talking in the Dark. Welcome. The aim of this podcast is to raise awareness about blindness, visual impairment, and disability in general, in a happy and light-hearted way. For those of you that don't know, I am blind. I was born with a condition called bilateral anophthalmia. Try spelling that one. It basically means that when I was born, my eyes didn't develop properly, so I wear prosthetics instead. The goal of this podcast is to remove some of the stigma and stereotypes around disabilities, whilst also having fun at the same time. Each week, I will be interviewing people from all walks of life, including some with hidden or physical disabilities like mine, and getting to know a little bit more about them and the lives they lead. This week, I am very excited to tell you that I will be talking to Gary O'Donoghue, who is also blind and is the Chief North America Political Correspondent for BBC News. My name is Evie Roberts, and this is my podcast, Talking in the Dark. Welcome. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Evie. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
How's your day been?
Well, it's just starting here in Washington. It's not early morning, but it's sort of middle of the morning. And so we've had our editorial meeting and we're working out what the stories of the day are. And I'm being asked that possibly to do something for the 10 o'clock news later on the race for the new House of Representatives Speaker, which is a hot political issue here in Washington this week. So things I think are going to get busier later in the day. And of course, we're all following the developments in Israel and the impact that has here in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I know that you're very busy, so thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's lovely to meet you.
Great to be here.
So can you begin by telling us a bit about what life was like for you growing up as a blind child?
Sure. So my background really in terms of blindness is that when I was born with pretty poor sight. And in fact, while I was a baby, they had to remove one of my eyes. But I had some partial sight in the other eye, although it wasn't very good. And during my sort of early childhood, I had a couple of the retina detached a couple of times in that good eye. And eventually, when I was 8 years old, they couldn't fix it anymore. And that was the point. So I've been really totally blind, and I don't have any light perception or anything like that since I was 8 years old. Now, up until that point, I'd gone to a school for partially sighted children in London. But when I was 8, I was sent away to a weekly boarding school for blind children in Kent, where I spent 3 years. And then after that, I was sent to another boarding school up in Worcester, where I stayed until I was 18 after my A-levels.
Right, okay. So you went to quite a few schools then. Did that impact you in any way?
It's a really interesting question. I think going away to boarding school at 8 years old is quite a wrench. I think I certainly remember that being a wrench. And, it's a long, long time ago, but I do remember the first night, being left alone there by my parents. And it was incredibly hard for me, incredibly hard for them, I must say, as well. But they were advised, and I think at the time, in the context of the time back then, they were advised rightly because it wasn't really possible in regular schools to get the kind of support that's available nowadays to people like yourself who've got a visual impairment, who are blind. The schools weren't geared up for that at all. And when blind children did stay in regular schools, they were really just left to their own devices. They fell behind. They weren't taught properly. Whereas in these blind schools, that everything was geared to obviously teaching us the way we could learn properly. And so the irony, I think, of it is that going blind, I think I actually ended up with a much better education than I would have got had I been a sighted child like my two brothers, who were at pretty poor state schools in our local area in Essex.
Right, okay. So is it true that you played blind football for England at some point?
That is true. Yes, that is true. Only a couple of times, to be fair. But when I was at Worcester, which is the the school, which is still there actually. Worcester it used to be called Worcester College for the Blind. It's now called New College Worcester. When I was there, we were football mad. We absolutely loved football. We played it every break time. We played it every evening because, again, that was a boarding school where you stayed for a half a term at a time, so you were there most of your life, really. And it was just at the time where sort of international blind football was starting to get going a bit. And I was one of those who was selected to play a few games for the England team. And we went to Spain and played in a tournament there, for example. And they played with a different ball to the one we were used to, which was a bit off-putting. But yeah, it was quite an experience. And I suppose that was when I was about 17 or 18 or so.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. Now, I know that you work for the BBC and have done for quite some time. Can you tell me about how your career in journalism began?
Well, as in many ways, like many journalism careers, by accident, I think. I mean, I didn't really when I went to university, I went to study French literature and philosophy. So I had really no intention of being a journalist at that point in time when I was 18, although I had been editor of the school magazine at Worcester. But and while I was at university, I was looking at other things, maybe doing some work in computing because I'd done a computing A level and other things like that, and thinking about maybe being a lawyer and all those kinds of things. And then because I was doing a language degree, I spent a year abroad. I lived as a student in Paris for a year. And while I was there, I somehow, and I can't quite remember how this came about, but I offered to do a couple of interviews for a program called In Touch, which is the program for blind people on Radio 4. And they said yes, and I did a couple of interviews, and I brought them back, and they put them on the radio. And then, at the end of that year, when I'd been abroad before my final year at university, I managed to persuade someone to take me on as a sort of temporary researcher on one of the news programs in the BBC, which I did. And then I went back to university, and really it kind of started from there. I applied for a couple of the training schemes that the BBC use, and I was turned down, which was very difficult at the time because I felt I demonstrated, quite a commitment by that point in time. But I carried on, and there were enough good people who thought I had something to offer. And so bit by bit, after I left university, I got, a couple of month contract here and a couple of months there. And about a year after I'd left university, I ended up getting a permanent job. And that's where I've been ever since.
Right, okay, that's really cool. So I know that you are now based in Washington as the Chief North American Political Correspondent for the BBC. Can you tell us a bit about this role and what it entails?
Yeah, so we have what we call a bureau, which is another word for an office here in Washington, D.C. The BBC also has an office in New York and another one in Los Angeles. And our job here is to cover what's happening in North America, all aspects of it, from the politics of the White House and Congress, through the sort of social changes and the problems that America faces, be that gun violence or issues around race, issues around the cost of living, natural disasters, all these kinds of things. It's our job to cover, not just for an American audience, but for a UK audience and a world audience, because of course BBC is the biggest news organization in the world. And so my job is principally focused on a lot of politics. So I will write pieces for the website. I will appear on television, on the news bulletins. I will appear on the radio news programs like the Today program or the World at One, the World Tonight, these sorts of programs. And I will be interviewed by presenters and try and explain what's going on. And we also do features sometimes where we go out and we record interviews and cut them into a sort of nicely crafted piece that is also played out. So day to day, that's really what I do. But our sort of role as a correspondent as such is really to try and explain and analyze as much as possible. America, everyone thinks they know America. We speak the same language, but it's a very, very different place to the UK. and to the rest of the world. And of course, it's a very important place. It's, the center of world politics in many ways. What happens here reverberates all around the world, because of the sheer power the United States has. So it's a very busy place, and one that keeps us busy a lot of the time. And we're dealing with issues that really do matter. They are, questions of war and peace and life and death and prosperity and poverty. All these big issues are ones that we have to tackle here and explain to a global audience.
Wow, okay.
Mm.
So I note that there have obviously been a number of technology breakthroughs during your career. Do you think that these advancements in technology have helped to make your job more accessible?
Oh, there's no question about that at all. No question at all. I mean, I can cast my mind back to perhaps 2 or 3 years into my career when I was working as a reporter on the Radio 4 Today program, which is, the big breakfast show news program on Radio 4 in the mornings. And I was one of about 10 reporters. And in those days, if you were asked to do a story or to research something, they had a news cuttings library. So literally a room, massive room in the building where people cut up newspapers, the articles out of newspapers, and put them in paper files under certain categories and headings. And if you wanted to do some research, one of these people would photocopy snippets of newspapers onto big sheets of A3 paper. Now, of course, that's not much use to us, is it? So those, and I would then have to spend time trying to persuade, another researcher to read this stuff to me before I could get cracking and on the phone and ringing people up, and it would sometimes put me a day behind. Now, it's when the PC came in first of all, and the ability to sort of search online came, and then later on, obviously with phones, iPhones and Android phones, the ability to access information independently absolutely revolutionized the way I work. It meant I could be as efficient or close to as efficient as everyone else. And that was very liberating, I must say. I mean, technology is a sort of double-edged sword, I think, for us as blind people, because, sometimes there's an advance and sometimes then stuff breaks and doesn't get fixed. And sometimes, people who write programs for computers don't write them in an accessible way or a usable way for us. So, we use our screen reader and we start tabbing around and it doesn't say anything, or it doesn't say anything useful. So there are all those challenges, but there's no question that technology has made my job much easier, and allowed me to do much more. And I think, I'm a tiny bit of a geek, I think, when it comes to this stuff by nature. But I think for blind people generally, they're in many ways in the working environment, they're forced to be a bit more geeky than they might be naturally, because you've got to understand, because actually most people don't understand how we use computers. They can't imagine what it is not to be able to see the whole screen, or not to use a mouse, or not to just, they just say, well, why don't you just click on that thing up there? That doesn't obviously translate for us. We have to read the screen serially, from beginning to end, from top to bottom. And I think that forces us to be to take more control of our technical world. And for a lot of people, that's not that easy. But I think it's one of those inevitable things you have to do as a blind person. It's sort of grit your teeth and actually understand the technology. So when there's a problem, you can at least start by doing your own troubleshooting, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, definitely. I would say you're completely right that you do have to sort of learn your way around technology. I have lots of sighted friends, and they're all sort of fascinated by my screen reader on my
Yeah.
phone and my laptop, which
Yes.
I have at quite a fast speed. And one of my favorite things is the reaction that my friends have when I show them my screen reader, because they literally can't believe that I'm able to use a phone.
Yes. No, I mean, I promise you get that with adults as well. I mean, I told my boss the other day, if I took your iPhone off you, I could use it within, 30 seconds. And she didn't really believe me, to be honest. But yeah, so the one thing I would say about the sort of the digital world is that, and it's this thing about sometimes things get taken away as well. things like, we rely a lot on Twitter, or have done in the past, or X as it's now called. And because of the upheavals there, a lot of the accessibility has disappeared. And certainly what we call third-party applications, other people who write Twitter applications with an accessible kind of view in mind, have been forced out. So sometimes there are backward steps. And also with the with social media, it is, because we, as I say, we read stuff in a linear fashion. We can't really scan in the way sighted people do. And there's so much material that sometimes it's hard for us to keep up. So I think you have to sort of develop other techniques. So, if you've got a bunch of friends who are obviously plugged into, TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that, if they see memes that are flying around that are getting a lot of traffic and a lot of interest, I'd encourage them to tell you, this is happening, because you might not be across it as much, and get them to explain what it is and what it means, because you want to be as up to speed. And sometimes our ability to use the technologies can hold us back from that understanding, given the sheer amount of information and the sheer quantity of different ways in which it comes in nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had cases where my friends have like sent me like TikToks, or like even
Mm.
when they send me pictures, and I have to ask them to actually send me a message
Sure.
describing it.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's nice. And of course, friends will do that, so that's great. And I think you'll find over time you'll know which people get it. If it's a difficult phrase, get it, but I hope you know what I mean. Some people get it, and some people don't when it comes to blindness. And when you find the people who get it, hang on to them.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean about that. There are just people who it just seems to click with them, and
Yeah,
I always stay very close to those people.
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So I would imagine that the world of journalism is quite unpredictable and fast paced. How do you deal with those elements?
Well, that's partly what we were just talking about now. I mean, most correspondents, me included, has a dedicated producer working with them. So I have a producer. In fact, the chap who was just in here a moment ago, Rod, he's working with me at the moment, and he's kind of, it's his job to keep me up to speed with information and the requests that are coming in for me to do, and to manage my time a bit in that sense. So that makes life a little bit easier for me. Otherwise, I do my best to watch and listen to as much as I can. I'm quite sort of ruthless about choosing, for example, which news podcasts I listen to, because there are a million of them, right? You can't listen to them all, but I carefully pick the ones that I listen to, and I make sure I put the time aside to do that. I make sure, here in the United States, we've got quite famous newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. I make sure that I have those, on my favorites on my internet browser, so I can get to them quickly. And sometimes I use what's called an RSS reader, which is a sort of a program that goes out there and grabs articles from news sources and puts them in a very accessible sort of interface, so you can read them quicker. So one of the things, for example, with my producers, I say to them, don't send me a link to an article. Go to the article, copy and paste it, and send it to me in the body of an email, because I can read it. It saves. It's not that I can't go to the website and read it. I can, but it saves me time. And time is the issue when you can't see. You're always trying to make up time on, other people, because basically you can do things faster if you can see, largely. So anything that sort of cuts down the time, I do. And I, encourage people I work with to think in that way. But you bump up against other technical problems. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of, PDF documents, and how sometimes they can be an absolute pain to read with a screen reader. Sometimes they're great if they've been authored properly. So there are always, but there are increasing numbers of tools. So, and artificial intelligence is going to help in this way a lot. I don't know if you've been trying out the Be My Eyes AI tool that they've got, but it is now incredibly powerful when it comes to describing and reading stuff quickly, and in a detailed way. So I think a lot of things are there are going to be a lot of tools, and the challenge for us as blind people will be to work out which tools we need rather than just trying to use them all. Which are the most effective in which situations, and have those to our fingertips, and know how to use them properly and quickly to keep up. Because I'm sure in a school environment, as a blind person, you're paddling under the surface furiously the whole time, aren't you, just to keep up?
Yeah, I mean, I've been blind since birth, and I read Braille.
Mm.
And so I used to have a Perkins Braille. I don't know. Do you read
Mm.
Braille?
Yes, I'm a big Braille fan. I was taught it as soon as I lost my sight, and I think it's an absolute. I wouldn't say essential, because I know blind people who work without, but the numbers of blind people who are employed. I mean, the numbers of blind people who read Braille is very small, but the numbers of those who are employed who are Braille readers is much higher, and I think that tells you something. I think Braille
Yeah,
is essential if you can have it. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. So yeah, I started off with a Perkins Braille, which for my
Mm.
listeners, I can only describe it as it looks like a typewriter. And then I got and I mean, it was great in a primary school setting where class was never silent because it was heavy and it was loud. But when I got to high school, we were like, okay, we need to get something more portable. And so I got a Braille Note Touch, which I'm currently reading my questions off of. And I totally know what you mean about sort of always furiously trying to catch up, because I am so quick at typing now, like taking notes in class. I have
Yes.
to learn to be a really quick typer just to be at the same level as all my classmates.
Absolutely. And I think I don't know if you use grade two Braille, but one of the great things about grade two Braille, if you're using a Braille keyboard, not on a Perkins nowadays, but is that because it's grade two, it's a shorthand. And so, for example, if I go to a press conference, I take a Braille. I haven't got the Braille note, I've got a different one, but very similar. And I can hang it around my neck on its strap, and I can take pretty much verbatim notes because I'm typing in Braille. And that's at a time when a lot of my colleagues, journalistic colleagues, don't do shorthand anymore. So they struggle to keep up taking quotes down.
Yeah, I mean, I do read grade two Braille, and it is such a lifesaver. I couldn't
Yeah.
imagine having to type in grade one now.
No, no, absolutely. Well, that's great. That's really good. I think it's one of those skills that, and it will. I mean, like this interview we're doing now, where you can read your questions. If later in life, whatever role you end up in, if you're in a meeting or something, the ability to refer to notes without having to plug your headphones into a computer and try and listen to what's happening in the room, I think is a huge advantage.
Oh, definitely. So I would imagine that you've had to deal with quite a few reactions and behaviors as a blind journalist. So how have you dealt with these?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one, isn't it? Because everyone's different, blind people and sighted world, and sometimes you do bump up against people who are unhelpful or worse, can be hostile to people with disability, and it's very upsetting when it happens, and very difficult when it happens. I think. What do I think? I think that one of the other things I talked about technology earlier. One of the other things as a blind person you have to sort of work on over time, and I don't claim to be anywhere near perfect at this. I'm certainly not, but over time, I think one has to sort of consciously work on one's own resilience. And what I mean by that is to not to try your best not to get knocked off course by negative experiences. Now, there's nothing wrong, I'm not saying anyone should ignore them or pretend they don't happen. You can't. But to sort of pursue your own goals despite the difficult moments. And that's not always easy. Some days one feels stronger than other days to cope with the sort of ups and downs of not being able to see. It's not always, you can't always be consistent as a blind person, because one day is different to the other. But I think, if you feel you've come up against a barrier, you have to choose how best to navigate it, how to go around. And I mean, a sort of not a physical barrier. If you've come up against a barrier put in place by people as a sort of, they don't want you to do something, don't want to let you do something, or are making life difficult, you have to work out the best way around that. And most of the time that's going to be, talking to someone else or thinking of a different approach. you can't press the nuclear button every time when people behave badly, because it's not worth it, and won't do your own state of mind any good, being constantly angry about difficult situations and people being difficult. But I come back to the resilience thing, because I think that's the sort of building that confidence in oneself to say, okay, this is horrible, but it's not me. This is them, not me. This is their problem, not my problem. This is an attitudinal problem from that side, not from mine. And then working out the best way to deal with that. And it's not easy. I think things over my lifetime have improved. I mean, it was when I started working, Evie, it was still possible for an employer to say to a blind person, I'm not employing you because you're blind. That was legal in those days. So we've moved on from there, but that doesn't necessarily mean always that attitudes, that they take a lot longer to move on. They take generations in some ways to change. We've seen that with attitudes to women, attitudes to ethnic minorities. They don't think these things don't change overnight. But you have to deal with what the world offers you, and doing that in a sort of can-do way, and having your own resources to fall back on. And one of the things I really rely on, I don't know if this is something you have, but I have a couple of 2 or 3 blind friends who occasionally, we get together and we have a real moan about how stuff that's happened, because having a real moan to people who get it, who have experienced it themselves, can be very, very refreshing. Rather than bottling it up. But so that's one of the things I've found very useful over the years. And then you sort of feel better after that, because that at least someone in the world has understood, what experience you had and how it made you feel. Now that all sounds very sort of frightening and scary, and I don't mean to say that, because most of the time and most people are fine. They vary on the scale of getting it, as we were talking about earlier. But most people aren't malign. Most people have good intentions. So, I'm not in any way trying to suggest that this is a day-to-day battle. But sometimes it can be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it can. It's really good that you have a couple of blind friends who you can sort of share experiences with. I mean, I don't have any completely blind friends. I mean, I live on the Isle of Man and we're quite a small community, but my best friend is visually impaired. So she's as close as I can get to that, and she does
Yes.
understand it.
Yes. Well, that's great. That's great. Having someone to vent to, who is a good listener and does understand, it's really important, I think.
Oh, definitely. So, do you think that people with disabilities are underrepresented in the media?
Oh, there's no question about that. And I don't think you'd find anyone who would say they weren't, because they are underrepresented, massively underrepresented. When you think that disabled people are 20% of the population, as defined by the Equality Act, they are way underrepresented. And that's been one of the things that has been something I've talked about a lot over the years, and the ways in which it should be improved, and everyone says it should, and bit by bit there is some improvement. There has been improvement in some areas, but we're nowhere near where it should be. And it's from my point of view, it's important that the media reflects the country we live in. And if you don't see that many disabled people in dramas or in news or in entertainment shows, if you don't see many of them, then the broadcasters and the newspapers are not reflecting the country as it is. And to me, that's doing their readers, their listeners, their viewers a disservice.
Oh, yeah, I 100% agree with you. So, my final question for you: what has been your proudest moment in your career?
Oh gosh, wow. I think that's a good question. I don't know there are a few things I could point to. I mean, I remember, for example, when I was actually very early on in my career, I did a solo trip to Australia for the Today program, and went for 3 weeks and gathered material for 3 different reports and did it all on my own. And that was when I think I realized you can do this. I think I realized I could do this. And that I came back and I felt and they loved the pieces. They played them on the Today program, and I just thought, yeah, okay, I can do this. It was also a very proud moment for me, realizing actually in the 2016 election here in the US, I was in New York, where Hillary Clinton's what they call a watch party, where they have their sort of headquarters for the night on election night. And I remember, I mean, it was an extremely dramatic night, obviously, because she lost, and it was a big surprise. But I do remember pinching myself and thinking, look, a long time ago, you were, a small child in Essex, and, mum and dad weren't particularly privileged. My dad was a taxi driver. My mum worked behind a bar, and you've grown up with a disability, which has not always been easy. And look, here you are, you're reporting on the outcome of the American election in New York City. And I remember feeling very proud of what I'd achieved at that point in time as well. So there's been a few kind of moments like that. I get a lot of pleasure from, at the end of the day, if I think I've done a good job, and gone on the 10 o'clock news and done a good turn and explained something I think pretty clearly, and done something for our audiences. That gives me a lot of pleasure as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that really come into that category, I would guess. But yeah, traveling independently, I was really pleased with myself for being able to do that, and I thought that was the time when I thought, actually, you'll be all right.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, how did you find traveling independently?
Well, I mean, you develop a range of techniques, don't you? I mean, I fly back and forth all the time from here to London, and and I ask for assistance like anyone else. And you've probably seen on Twitter the battles that disabled people have in airports all the time, of being treated like luggage and like cargo, and being left and ignored and stuff like that. So you develop techniques, but I mean, for example, when I was in Australia, I would use taxis like everyone else, for example, to go from this interview to that interview. But I would say, if I found a really good taxi driver, and I don't mean a good driver, I mean someone who had information and knew about the place and knew stuff, I would hold on to their number and make sure I rang them next time, because I knew that I would get something extra than just a ride. I'd be able to get him to tell me stuff that would be useful, for example. So I do things like that. It's a similar idea to what we mentioned earlier about, when you find good people, hang on to them.
Oh yeah, definitely. So that's everything I wanted to ask you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been so lovely to meet you.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, and I hope the podcast is going really well. I think it's an amazing thing for you to be doing, and you're obviously a pro already.
Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far, but thank you. And thank you to my audience for listening, and I will see you all next time.